Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this ToxLearn for EU lessons from the summer school held in Hasselt, Belgium. I would like to teach you the risk characterization of chemicals in food. My name is Ariane Vettorazzi. I'm full professor of the University of Navarra in Pamplona, Spain. This is the outline of the lesson. First, I will give you the key aspect of food risk analysis, and I will go in depth to the risk characterization process and explain you how to derive health-based guidance value. Then I will teach you how risk characterization statements should be written, and I will briefly introduce you to the margin of exposure tool. Finally, you can find a slide with the references that I've used to create this lesson. Let's move to the food risk analysis. Food risk analysis, as described by WHO, the World Health Organization, is defined as 3 steps: the risk assessment, risk management, and the risk communication step. Indeed, the risk analysis paradigm is a formal description of the risk analysis process that emphasizes the functional separation of risk analysis, of risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication, while at the same time demanding the need of communication between all these steps. Within risk analysis, the functional separation between risk assessment and risk management is essential to ensure the scientific objectivity of the risk assessment process. So, I would like you to think about which is the main difference between risk assessment and risk management. Risk assessment is science-based, is carried out by scientists, while risk management is policy-based and is carried out by risk managers or policymakers. Now, I would like you to think about which parts of risk analysis does these 2 European institutions cover: the EFSA, which is the European Food Safety Authority, and the European Commission. The EFSA, which is the Agency for Europe for Food Safety, carries out risk assessment and also risk communication, while the European Commission, that lays down the maximum levels of food contaminants, for example, is a risk management institution. Let's move to the risk assessment step. This process has mainly 3 big steps: the hazard identification and characterization, the exposure assessment, and the risk characterization. The first step, which is the hazard identification and characterization, is what we call in toxicology as the toxicological evaluation. Basically, it describes the toxicity, which is the hazard. Indeed, the toxicity is defined as the ability of a substance to cause damage to a living organism. Is indeed an inherent property of the agent to cause an adverse effect, and this means that it cannot be changed. When we characterize the toxicological potency or the hazard characterization, what we do is to describe qualitative or quantitatively the inherent properties of these agents to cause an adverse effect. Is what we call in toxicology the dose response, is to relate the effect or the adverse effect with the dose of the compound. The second step of risk assessment is the exposure assessment. And here what we do is to evaluate the probable ingestion of a chemical agent through food, as well as, if necessary, exposure derived from other sources. For example, if you are barbecuing meat, you might be exposed to PAH, which are polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, but you are also exposed to PAH by inhalation because there are environmental pollutants due to traffic. What we do in exposure assessment is to combine data on the concentration of the chemical substance present in food, the level of PAH in the meat, with the quantity of those food consumed, the amount of meat you consume daily, which are the consumption data. And the last step of risk assessment is to characterize the risk, which is the qualitative and, wherever possible, the quantitative determination, including all the uncertainties related with this risk characterization, of the probability of occurrence of the known and potential adverse effect of an agent in a given organism, system, or population under defined exposure conditions. This is very important because you will characterize the risk for a determined population. It's not the same to characterize the risk for the general population or for children or for vegetarians because they have a different consumption pattern. And it's also not the same to define or to characterize the risk for Mediterranean countries or for other countries worldwide because we have different food consumption patterns. So let's move on to the risk characterization. Risk is a combination of the data of toxicity and the data from the exposure assessment. Now, I would like you to think about which is the difference between hazard and risk. To explain the difference, I would like to show you this slide that comes from the European Food Safety Authority, where it clearly states that hazard is something that has the potential to harm you, while risk is the likelihood, is the probability of a hazard causing harm. So, for example, in a sea, the shark is a hazard, but swimming with a shark is a risk. The same for the lightning. The lightning is a hazard, but if you're not exposed to it because you are in-house, you don't have any risk. But if you're standing under a tree during a thunderstorm, here you'll have a risk because you might be exposed to it. So basically, for food contaminants, the risk is the combination of the toxicity and the exposure. So if you have a substance that is not very toxic, but you are exposed on a daily basis, you might have a risk. But you have a substance that is very toxic, but you are not exposed at all because it does not appear in food, for example, the risk might be very low. Another question before we move to the next step is, I would like to thank you to think about if there is any difference in characterizing the risk of a food contaminant, for example, a mycotoxin, which is a toxin produced by fungi, and a food additive or a pharmaceutical drug. Yes, there is difference and important differences. When we are dealing with food additives or pharmaceuticals, we are dealing with substances that need a pre-market authorization. It means that there's a company behind that wants to commercialize them. It means that there will be an agency that will control the data to allow or not this food additive or this pharmaceutical drug to be used. Moreover, normally the toxicological data that are created by this company are created under GLP compliance, which means good laboratory practice compliance. There is the quality system behind the pharmaceutical company normally to create good quality data for toxicological studies, and are normally following standardized tests as the OECD test guidelines for the testing of chemicals that are used for pharmaceutical or for any chemical compound. So there is a kind of standardization and a quality system behind. What happens with food contaminants? Nobody is putting this contaminant in food, however they are appearing. It's what we call post-market authorization processes. There are no company behind, and normally the agencies need to use data from published literature from different scientific groups to carry out the risk assessment. Basically, what we have here is the risk analysis process. And to carry out the risk analysis, what we have to do is to have toxicological data that are normally carried out by toxicologists carrying out toxicity evaluation. Then we have a group of scientists that will determine the exposure assessment. And here is important to understand that the exposure will be determined by the use of the compound. So basically, if a pharmaceutical is approved, normally it's because a medical doctor will prescribe it and a pharmacist will give you the pharmaceutical drug in a drugstore. It means that the exposure will be different if this pharmaceutical appears in food naturally and you'll be exposed on a daily basis in all your food. So remember that the exposure will depend on the use of the chemical. So take into account the exposure data and the toxicity data. We'll have to quantify or characterize the risk. And depending on the benefit, we'll have to decide if this risk will be acceptable or not. For example, if it's acceptable to have some adverse effect for some pharmaceuticals, for example, and if the risk is not acceptable, we'll have to take measures to lower the exposure. In this slide, I would like you to think about which agencies or international organisms do carry out risk characterization. The IARC, which is the International Agency for Research on Cancer from WHO, the ERLEX, which is the database for the European laws, the HSDB, which is a database for toxicological data, the EFSA, which is European Food Safety Authority from the European Union, or the Food and Drug Administration from the United States of America. So yes, you are right if you think that EFSA and FDA carried out risk characterization. ERLEX is basically a risk management tool where the laws are laid down. The ToxNet database is a database for toxicity identification or characterization, and IARC as well. And I would like to give you these examples from the IARC. IARC monographs, which are monographs where the level of certainty that a substance can cause cancer is explained, classifies compounds depending on the level of certainty regarding their ability to cause cancer in humans. So you have compounds classified as group 1 that are considered to be carcinogenic to humans, while we have some compounds with a lower level of certainty in the classification that are not classifiable as it's their carcinogenicity to humans, because we don't have enough data for characterizing it in humans. So as IARC clearly states, this classification does not indicate the level of risk because it only takes into account the hazard and is not taking into account the exposure. So let's move on to how we can derive health-based guidance value. Health-based guidance value may be derived from either the NOAEL, as it was explained in a previous session, or the benchmark dose that was explained in another session during this summer school. These NOAELs or benchmark dose can be called together as point of departure. The NOAEL approach has been used for 15 years, and testing guidelines have been developed to ensure that the toxicological data are suitable to identify the adverse effect of concern and also to define a NOAEL. In the benchmark dose approach, a NOAEL does not have to be identified, but doses with graded responses are needed to provide an optimal model output. To set up health-based guidance value provides quantitative information from risk assessment to risk managers, enabling them to make decisions concerning the protection of human health. So, from a NOAEL, you can estimate the tolerable exposure limit for humans. What is a NOAEL? NOAEL is indeed the highest concentration or quantity of a substance that is experimentally determined that do not produce observable adverse effects under a defined exposure condition. So here you can have different doses where you have treated rats and you are assessing a toxicological response. So the NOAEL means that from this point and higher doses, you have adverse effect, while the NOAEL is the highest dose where you do not detect this adverse effect. Health-based guidance value can be determined by different commissions and sometimes change the name depending on the framework. For example, we have acceptable daily intakes that are normally laid down for additives and pesticides by commissions such as the Joint Commissions for Food Additive or Pesticides from FAO, which is the Food Agriculture Organization, and WHO, which is the World Health Organization. We can lay down tolerable daily intakes for contaminants by EFSA, or tolerable weekly intakes if you think the contaminant has a long half-life, so you don't have to give the information on a daily basis, but you can give it on a weekly basis, or the reference dose for contaminants, which is normally used by the Environmental Protection Agency from the United States. These health-based guidance values are for non-cancer outcomes. Let's give an example for tolerable daily intake calculation. So what is a tolerable daily intake in food? It's an estimate of the amount of a substance in food or air, but basically when we are working with food is only in food or drinking water, that can be taken in a daily basis per unit or body weight over a lifetime without having an appreciable health risk. It is expressed as a milligram per kilogram of body weight per day. So basically what we do is to take the NOAEL or benchmark dose and divide it by uncertainty factors. We can also calculate health-based guidance value for acute exposure, such as the acute reference dose, which is the amount of a substance that can be ingested in a period of 24 hours or less for acute effects, for example, for pesticides or marine biotoxins, per unit of body weight without appreciable health risk to consumer. So basically the difference here is that it can be ingested for 24 hours or over a lifetime on a daily basis for the tolerable daily intake. So here you can have in this table the guidance and other values commonly used in chemicals evaluations. As I mentioned, the most important for non-cancer outcomes are the tolerable daily intakes, the weekly intakes, monthly intakes also, or acceptable daily intakes, and an acute reference dose. Yes, I did explain that you have to take a NOAEL and divide it by uncertainty factors. But if you are dealing with a compound, in fact, you might find a lot of different toxicological studies with different exposure routes, different type of effects analyzed, even different types of exposure or duration of the assays, and different animal species. So the question here is which study should I take to derive the health-based guidance value? So normally when we deal with food, we prefer oral studies, and we always try to take the most sensitive effect. It means the effect that was observed at the lowest dose in a study which has a longer exposure, because when we deal with food, we are exposure on a daily basis over our lifetime. And then the most sensitive species, which is the animal species that show the most sensitive effect. So what we're building is like the worst case scenario to divide it by the uncertainty factors, because all these studies have different source of variations. For example, one of the most common source of variation that we always do take into account is that these studies are carried out in animal species. However, we are extrapolating to human. So we normally divide it by 10. And in human population, we know that we might have sensitive population. So at least we divide it by 110 by 10. But in some compounds, you might have other sources of variations. You might not have, for the pivotal study, a longer exposure, or you are not able to detect a NOAEL because all the doses that have been administered to animals already showed an adverse effect, which is the lowest observable adverse effect level. So if we sum up what we do to do this risk assessment, or how we will be using this health-based guidance value for risk managers, what we do is scientists will carry out the toxicological evaluation and will determine an NOAEL, which is an experimental data. Then some uncertainty factors will be established depending on the quality and the variations that you might find in the different experimental data. Once you have the tolerable daily intake, risk managers take into account the weight and also the intake of the food they want to regulate, will establish maximum limits. So this is policy makers, so it means risk managers. But of course, we have to always be monitoring that the maximum levels are not surpassing the tolerable daily intake. So we need to monitor the exposure basically by measuring the levels of the food contaminant in food and in the different foods and in different water. But also we have to take into account that this process might be changed because we have new data from the toxicological point of view, or we are able to lower the limits because new technological aspects that help us to lower down the maximum limits. And also we always have to monitor the human population, for example, with human biomonitoring studies, where we can measure the level of the compound in plasma of humans, and to try to relate it with the levels of food and water. So this is what we do during the exposure assessments. So to give you an idea how regulators will lay down maximum levels, you have here the Commission regulation that lay down the maximum level for certain food contaminants in Europe. An example, you have the screenshot for aflatoxin B1. So basically what we do is to do a risk assessment. As I mentioned, is a scientifically based process where you lay down the health-based guidance value. But then risk managers have to set the maximum limits in laws. But this will take into account other factors that are not taken in risk assessment process. For example, the economical factors, the legal factors, the politics, the social perception or the cost benefit, or the real option. For example, for aflatoxin B1, the risk assessors will say that the level of exposure should be 0 because of the genotoxic and carcinogen. However, we will find maximum limits because it's not feasible to have levels that are 0 because it's a food contaminant that appears naturally in food. Of course, during all this process, we have to take into account risk communication that should be always very clear between risk assessors and risk managers, but also risk should be communicated to the general population, and it should be taken into account that the perception of risk might change between populations. So let's move on how we should state these risk characterizations results. So the risk characterization statements will integrate the exposure assessment and the hazard characterization to help the decision making. So basically, what we have to do is to help the risk managers to take decisions. So what risk characterization should do is to provide estimates of potential health risk in different exposure scenarios. Therefore, it might describe all the assumptions, the nature, the relevance, and the magnitude of the risk, and include clear explanations of any uncertainty in the risk assessment resulting from gaps in the science base. It means, for example, that if you are lacking long exposure studies, you have to clearly state that in the uncertainties. You have also to give information on the susceptible subpopulations, including those with greater potential exposure, for example, vegetarians, if you're assessing some contaminants that might affect vegetables or cereals, for example, or if you're taking into account specific or genetic factors, or you're taking into account infants or toddlers in the assessment. So this should be clearly stated. And these risk characterization statements can be qualitative or quantitative. You can have a qualitative statement, such as statements or evidence that a chemical is of no toxicological concern, owing to the absence of toxicity, even at high exposure levels. So the compound is considered non-toxic or with very low toxicity. Statements or evidence that the chemical is safe in the context of a specified use. It means that how we are using it's safe, but if you're going to change the use, you might reassess this risk. And then recommendations to avoid, minimize, or reduce the exposure. But nowadays, what we prefer is to have quantitative risk characterization statements. Basically, what we like to have is to have a comparison of a dietary exposure with health-based guidance value. Then we have estimates of risk at different level of dietary exposure, or risk at minimum and maximum dietary intakes, for example, nutrients or vitamins. You might need a minimum of vitamins to have a good health balance, but if you have vitamin A above a certain level, you might also have adverse effect. And then we have the tool of the margin of exposure that I will explain in the next slides. So what is the margin of exposure? So the margin of exposure is not a health-based guidance value because it is a tool used by risk assessor to consider possible safety concerns arising from the presence in food and feed of a chemical substance. But when they deem that is inappropriate or unfeasible to establish a health-based guidance value. So here's my question. When do you think it is inappropriate or infeasible to establish a health-based guidance value? So from EFSA point of view, two main situations can occur. The first one is when you assess a substance that is not genotoxic or carcinogenic, but for which there is uncertainty about their effect because we do not have enough toxicological data. So we cannot establish a health-based guidance value due to the lack of scientific data. And the second situation is when we assess a substance that we know that is genotoxic and carcinogenic, in which case it is considered that a health-based guidance value should not be established because scientists consider that any level of exposure could theoretically lead to cancer. So there is no threshold. So how do we calculate the margin of exposure? So basically, we have to take a point of departure. So as I mentioned before, this can be a NOAEL or a benchmark dose. It means it's a dose at which a low but measurable effect is observed, for example, or no toxic effect is still observed in the case of NOAEL. And then divided by human exposure, which is the level of exposure of a substance for a given population. So I would like to highlight again that the margin of exposure is not a health-based guidance value, but is a useful tool when there is evidence of harmful effect, but we don't know enough to confirm how much is safe. It tells if current intakes are likely to be harmful or not. And just to help you on how we interpret this margin of exposure, low margin of exposure indicates high risk. So normally, a margin of exposure below 100 means that there is a concern for substances that are neither genotoxic or carcinogenic, or when we have a margin of exposure lower than 10,000 is a concern for substances for both genotoxic and carcinogenic. So finally, you can have this slide where you have all the references from all the guidelines that I've used for creating this lecture. And of course, thank you very much for your attention, and do not hesitate to contact me if you want to know a bit more about this lecture. Thank you very much.